All right.
And
So
okay, so if just a little, I guess, like
Oh,
a
yeah,
reason,
yeah.
if you guys were wondering why we were a little late today, there's actually another class that comes before this class that they use the same like Zoom room, so it's just that we have to wait for them to finish first. So that's just the reason why. Okay, so today we're gonna learn about syntax. Syntax is arguably one of the most important aspects of Python coding, right? It's like the basics. If you think about it as like the basic rules, like with how you write code in Python and how you're supposed to present it as well. So before that, I think we have a few slides about how to set up Replit again. So just again, make sure you have Replit set up with the correct languages. So of course you just need to choose Python as your primary language. If you choose any, you can choose any other language. It doesn't really matter. But as long as you have Python as your primary language, that is all that matters. And make sure you are able to like essentially get coding as soon as possible, because we might show examples in this lesson that you could try on your own as well.
yeah, so yes, we just have a couple of slides with Replit like instructions. So yeah, so this is we're probably not going to go over this for now, and this is more over something that you can reference off of if you need to revisit these slides. Yeah, all right. So yeah, we have our lesson outline for today. So we'll be going over syntax, and we'll be learning about indentation, comments, data types, variables, booleans, essential operators, and essential functions. And our goal for today is to be able to get a sense of how Python flows, continue to get a sense of how algorithmic thinking works, and we just want to overall understand syntax. Okay, so what is syntax firstly? So syntax is basically like a set of rules that defines how a Python program will be written and interpreted. So when you're writing code, there's certain like there's certain rules that you have to follow. So for example, if you want to print out a certain message, there's certain things that you have to do. For example, let's say I want to print out like the words "Hello World," then I would have to encapsulate the words "Hello World" within quotation marks and then within parentheses, and I also have to type print in front of that statement. So those are just kind of little things called syntax where we just have to follow. Yeah, so why do we learn syntax? So syntax is like the base rules for Python. So basically everything you do in Python involves syntax, so the rules that you have to follow, and everything builds up from syntax. So if you want to do more advanced programming in the future, maybe like you want to do graphics, you want to like draw things in Python, then you would have to really understand how syntax works. Because if one little thing in your code does not follow the rules of Python, then nothing will run. So this is just really important to remember. And basically, yeah, so syntax is an important foundation for any programming language. So this is just, this is not just for Python.
Okay, so I think the first rule we're going to talk about is indentation. So I think if you know in English, we have something called indent. So when you start a paragraph, a new paragraph, you press shift, it goes to the next line. And when you start a new paragraph, you indent. So you leave a space at the beginning of your paragraph, and it shows that it's like a new line. So it's very similar in Python, where like you go, we have an example. The example here is an if statement. You have an if statement, and in the next line you have an indent. So the indent simply just shows that the whatever line of code comes next, it goes within that if statement. So indentation is like very important. I think if you have an IDE like Replit, it's going to indent for you. But of course, if you use other software, they might not indent for you. So it's just that, just keep in mind that for certain pieces of code, you're going to have to indent if you go to the next line. Let's talk about comments now. So comments, this doesn't really affect the code itself. Comments are usually for like yourself, basically. So you can write a comment. It doesn't have to be in the coding language. It doesn't have to follow the rules of the coding language. But a comment just helps you. Maybe you want to write something to keep in mind of, or maybe you want to keep some notes next to your code. This is what you would do with a comment. So the way you have a comment in Java is you have a hashtag. So everything on the slide, if it's in green color, that's a comment. So it won't affect the code. It's just for you to like see, just for you to use as a reference, right? So again, it says that there are 3 reasons why you might use comments. It says to explain code, to make the code more readable, or to prevent execution. So like for example, so you can use it to make sure that line of code is not executed when you're testing the code. That's essentially what the third one means. So we have examples of like comments. So one example says this is a comment. That's it. That's basically, you can just put it wherever you want, and it won't affect the code directly. It's basically for your own use. I don't really use comments, but of course, when you have multiple lines of like when you start getting more advanced and you have more and more lines of code, comments are a good way to keep track of, like what does this piece of code do, and like maybe several lines later you can use it to explain what another piece of code does. It's just a very easy way to be organized, basically.
Yeah, and I think this is like a nice place where I can actually demonstrate how to do comments. So I'll share my screen into my Replit compiler. So you should be able to see my screen right now, and I just have a Replit open. So for example, let's say I wanna type like or I want to print hello world. Sorry, it's kind of slow. So I can print this, and obviously I'll get the words hello world. But let's say I want to use comments, right? So what I can do, like one of the easiest ways to do comments is on a Mac, you can press command and you can also press like the question mark. So this will automatically turn that into a comment. So if I run that, nothing will happen because it's commented out. But let's say let's say I'm not on a Mac and I want something easier to do, right? So without command, so I can just write the hashtag or type out the hashtag right there, and I can type whatever, and those will all be comments and nothing will be run. So I guess that's like a pretty simple way to describe how a comment works. This is actually pretty, although it seems pretty useless at first, once you get into more like advanced programming, it becomes really useful because you can like write yourself a bit like some notes in front of your code to help you remind yourself like what this code actually means. Yeah, so yeah, I'll share back.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about data types. So when we talk about, there's an important concept that we need to talk about, which is variables. So in Python, we have a certain concept called variables. Variables are just essentially storage boxes where you're able to store a certain value in. And of course, there are different types of like storages, right? So in this case, the different types of storages are able to store different values, which is why we have different data types. So and within Python, you're going to have to essentially declare what type of storage box these variables have to be. So like maybe at the top of your code, that's what we usually do. At the top of your code, you might declare a bunch of your variables. Some of them are going to be numbers, maybe words, or maybe like sentences, right? So you're going to have an important part of it is declaring what type of variable it is. And this is why we need to talk about data types. So I'm going to go over some of the most basic data types here, just so you're more familiar with them, because you're going to be using them a lot when you code in Python. We're also going to cover like strings and lists in more detail in a few more classes. So let's talk about the text, text data type. So the primary one we're going to be using are strings. So strings, simply put, they're a combination of symbols, letters, or like any characters, right? So a word can be a string. It's a combination of letters. a sentence can be a string because you have a bunch of letters and you have spaces in between and they're put in a certain order, in a certain sequence, right? So all of these are strings, and we're going to talk about more about this later on, but the way you show it's a string is if you have 2 quotation marks. That's how you show that it's a string. So let's talk about numeric types. So some data types that have to do with numbers. So we have 2 main data types, integers and floats. So if you see this the slide, it says int. That's an integer. Owen, you have a question, I think.
Yeah, I do. I've done all this already.
Okay, thank you. I think we know you're very smart. Okay, so, okay, so I think Austin mentioned this, but I think like if you think this is way too easy, of course you can try a different language.
I've been in your old classes.
Yes, of course, but
We remember you.
yes, yeah. But if you think this is way too easy, then of course you can always switch to another class. Like learn a different type of language. Like I think like the ultimate goal is to like acquire as many languages as you can, right? So that's what I suggest if you think this is too boring for you, but of course you can choose what you want to do. Thank you for that comment. Back to the what I was talking about. So integers. So integers and floats, they're both numbers, right? So an integer is it's just a number, like 1, 2, like all the way up to 10,000, whatever. But the difference between an integer and float, they're both numbers. A float has a decimal place and has digits after that decimal place. So if you're dealing with numbers that have a decimal place and they have like digits after the decimal, like 1.011, then that's a float. So you just have to be mindful. Like if you have you have digits after the decimal place, you're gonna have to declare it as a float. Next type, data type, sequence types. So when we talk about lists, we've mentioned this before. Essentially, a list is a data type where you're able to store different store values within that data type. So you can have a list full of integers, for example. So you're storing elements within a list. It's just a simple way to keep track of multiple variables at once and keep it within one, like maybe just keep it within the list to be more organized. There are also other ways, perhaps you can cycle through different, when you learn loops, you can cycle through lists, and it's a cool way to perhaps find a specific variable that you're looking for. And the last data type we're going to talk about is a Boolean. So this is a little hard to explain because when we talk about Booleans only have 1 or 2 like values essentially. It's either a zero, a yes or a no, basically, a 0 or a 1. So at first, like this might seem very useless. Like, why does a Boolean only has 2 values? It can only give you 2 values. So this is more useful when you're talking about loops, right? So if a loop, if you have a condition for a loop might, like if it's just this, then do that. If it's something else, then do something else, right? So if it's Boolean, if it's true, then execute a certain line of code. If the Boolean returns false, then execute another line of code, right? So Booleans, I think they have to do with lists, like with loops more, where you're only dealing with maybe two scenarios, and in your condition, it can only return true or false. That's when you actually use a Boolean. So I think at first, you probably won't use Booleans as much, but when you're dealing with like loops later on, you're definitely going to use Booleans. That was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions before we move on about any of the data types? Eva said, can you enable chat, please? So chat is right now is enabled. Everyone's typing in chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess if you don't have any questions, like just feel free. Like if you're confused with any of it, we can of course explain it again. Basically, they're just like different variables, right? We have different variables. Variables, you're able to store values within these variables. And essentially, there are different types. You have to declare what type it is. You have to be very specific with it. So I've been told to, maybe we can, I think I might just disable chat for now.
Yeah, it's going.
So right now,
let's try to like unnecessary like chatting to a minimum, because I think like a lot of stuff that's going on in the chat is like unnecessary. So yeah.
Okay, so I only made it host only, so you can only talk with Austin or
Yeah.
me. I think someone had a hand up before, but
I had my hand up, but I was just gonna say it like for you to make it host only.
Okay, yeah, all right.
okay, yeah.
So
Thanks. Yeah, I just changed. Yeah.
you can still like ask us questions, but it will be just a direct message.
Okay, I guess if you have no questions, I think we can continue.
Okay, yeah, so we just have additional like slides on data types, as this is a very important concept in Python. So basically we have some examples on the slide. So the first like example you can see is a list of fruits. So we have apple, banana, and cherry. So again, like syntax comes to play here. If you want to have like strings inside a list, they have to be in quotation marks. And how a list works is that we have brackets on left and right, and then each item is separated by commas. So right now, learning how a list works isn't too important right now, as we'll cover that later on in our program. But for now, I would like to direct your attention to how a string and how an int works. So basically, we have a second example here. We have comments saying str strings are arrays of bytes representing Unicode characters. So you don't really have to understand what this means. Just know that a string are just like basically characters that you can manipulate. But the real difference between a string and an int is that an int has to be like a number, and it's a very specific number. It can't be like a decimal number. It is just a whole number, but it can also be negative. And we have floats. So floats are very similar to ints, but they're just decimal numbers. So they have like additional numbers that go off. For example, if we want to if 5 is declared as a float, then it would be 5.0. So instead of just having a 5, there would be point and then 0. And then we also have a list of numbers. You can also have a list of numbers, like a list of strings, like at the very top. And then obviously true is a Boolean, so you can have true or false values in a Boolean. And yeah, so I think those are some pretty basic examples of what a data type is. But for now, I would just ask you guys to just focus on how an int and how a string works, because those are the two data types that we will be primarily using in this course. All right, so now we have a slide on casting. So casting is converting between data types. So let's say if we want to convert an int to a string, we can totally do that. We have a nice chart here declaring all the things you can convert to. So this is not too important right now because it's a bit of an advanced concept. So for example, if you have like an integer and you want to convert that into a float, or if you want to convert that into a string, there are certain things you can do, which is called casting, which is you basically have like a function where you can convert that specific data type into another data type. But for now, we're just not going to focus too much on this as this is an advanced concept. Okay, yeah, so now we'll go on to Python variables. So variables are essentially storage boxes for things. So for example, a variable is created the moment you assign a value to it. And we have 4 examples. So we can call a variable x, and we can set that equal to 10, which is automatically an int. If you're creating variables, you don't have to declare what type it is, unlike Java. Other programming languages have different types of syntax you have to follow. But for Python, it's super simple. All you have to do is just set it equal to a certain like data type. For example, 10 is an integer data type by default because there's no like trailing numbers. So that would turn into a float, and there's no quotation marks, which will turn into a string. We have another variable down here called CP, and we set that equal to computer programming. And as soon as like you have quotations around either a number or characters or words, it automatically converts that into a string data type. And then obviously for Boolean data types, if you set it to equal to true or if you set it to equal to false, it automatically it's defaulted as a Boolean. And then Y, if we have decimal numbers, it's defaulted as a float. So yeah, so this is really important that you understand, especially the differences between like, for example, like a 10 with no quotation marks and a 10 with quotation marks, because those are two different things. As like a very important concept you have to know is that numbers can be strings. So for example, if I put quotation marks on left and right side of that 10, then that turns into a string. All right, so Python variables part 2.
Okay, before we get on to the slide, so Dicky had a question, and to me, he said, why do you have to use bool and list in coding? Does it separate something? So list, remember, in a list, like I mentioned before, you are able to store many different values, right? So perhaps you can store like a bunch of numbers in a list, and they're all separate, right? So we have maybe we have the first item in the list is 1, the second item in the list is 2, the third item in the list is 3, right? It's in a specific order, and they're all within a list. So a list is useful because now, like if you're given a bunch of numbers, right? And like you don't want to put them individually as one variable, one variable, one variable. That's a little confusing, right? You have like 10 variables. Why not just put all of these numbers in one list, right? It's very organized. You have all of these numbers in one place. So if you want to retrieve, if you want to take out one number, all you have to say is, I want the fifth element within that list. So the computer will look at the 5th element in the list and it'll take it out for you. So that's a very simple term, like with how you do it. But you can manipulate lists in like a variety of different ways that you can't do with strings. So I think lists, you use lists if you have a bunch of variables that are very similar and you want to group it together in order to stay more organized. That's when you might want to use a list. With a bool, I think we have a slide on how bools are used, but I think bools you'll understand more if you have like an if statement, right? If something is true, then do something. If it is not true, then do something else. That's a bool, right? If something is true, if it's true, do this. If it's false, do something else. That's basically the definition of a bool. A bool only has two outcomes, true or false. So I think like a bool, like that's essentially how an if statement is going to work. It uses bools. So, and of course you'll learn how if statements work. If statements are very important when you talk about when you have situations, when you have different scenarios that can happen within the code. That's when you use if statements, and that's a totally new lesson. But I like that question because yeah, like it might seem confusing because integers and like numbers and strings are the two most important data types, but you also have lists, but they're important in different situations, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
And I think,
that was yeah.
and before we go on, I think it's actually pretty important that I give an example of the difference between a string and the difference between a integer. So right now I have my Riplet set up. I take 2 inputs, so we'll learn this later on. So how do we take in inputs and how do we declare those inputs? So I've declared this first input as a string and I declare the second input as an integer. So yeah, that's probably not the best name to call it, as like the function to take in an integer is also called int, but I think that'll do for now. So let's run my code and let's take in string as 10. So as we know, we can take in strings as numbers, and let's take in my integer as 10 as well. And once I press enter, I should get a print statement giving me the string plus string, and I should get a print statement giving me int plus int. So I press enter, and of course we see that we have 2 outputs right here. So the first, I have a string right here, so it tells me what I'm gonna get. So this is really good. So string adding a string. So obviously we take in string as 10, and as you can see, 10 plus 10 gives us 1010. So in a string, there's no like math involved. It just directly merges the 2 things together. But obviously, if we're adding integers or numbers, there's math involved. So we get 20. So yeah, so I think that's like the main difference between a string and like an integer. So if you're adding and if you're doing just general mathematical operations with integers, they'll add them with math. But then if you do operations like for example like add, then you'll just get them merged together. So
yeah, that is a really good example, because with strings you can't really do mathematics, right? Because strings, you're literally treating them like you're not treating them like numbers. So you're literally putting the 2 numbers side by side, whereas if you're treating it as an integer, you're adding the 2 numbers together. So that's a really good example.
Yeah. So
let's Yeah.
I think we have some questions. So I got a question from, I think, George. So how do you do the commands again? Yeah, so I'm pretty sure you're referring to the syntax. So I think we'll do some review at the end, but since I think we're running a bit short on time, we'll try to power through the rest of this slideshow presentation.
Wait, is it Jamie has their hand up?
When I go in Ripple, and I do the 3 dots, that thing, it says ellipsis.
Ellipses. So, wait, what exactly are you doing in Riplet? If you want to talk about like your situation, sorry. Okay. If you want to talk about your situation, like what you're what you're specifically coding, you can come to us after class. I think then you can actually, I think Max suggested that you can share screen. Yeah. So after class, if you want to talk about what you, like, if there are any problem, I think maybe there's a problem with your code, then you can share screens and
on that black thing, when I write 3 dots, why does it says ellipsis?
I'm not entirely sure. Sorry. Okay, so I don't think I can see. I don't really know like what you've written in your
I didn't
as your code.
I didn't write anything, but in the black thing, when I just type the thing there, I just typed 3 dots and it just appeared ellipsis.
I think we'll deal with technical difficulties at the end of class, as we can't really. It's not good for us to just allow you to share screen right now. So stay behind at the end of class, and we'll try to help you out.
Okay.
Okay. I think we'll move on to naming variables because there are actually there are distinct rules with how you're able to name variables. So there are a bunch of rules here. You can just have a look at look at the different rules with around like what you're able to name it and how like what you're not able to name a specific variable. So generally, like, just keep it short, right? If you have very long names for variables, like the first, like if you have like several words like put together as the name of your variable, like it's going to be hard to keep track of all of these variables, right? If you have lots of different variables. So I would suggest that like you keep it short. For me, like I literally name my variables like A, B, or C, like ABC, like I use 1-letter names because they're very simple, right? And when you want to refer to that variable again, like you just type, you can, sorry, I think I was lagging. So you can just type A, B, and C. So like it's very easy if you have shorter names. That's what I'm saying. But basically there's some, yeah. So if I'm lagging, just you can always just tell me and I can repeat. So I was saying that shorter names are usually better because they're easier to use. So some illegal variable names, it talks about how you can't start with a number, or you can't have like dashes, and you can't have a space in between your names. So these are some exceptions with like how you can't name your variables. So just stick with like simple names, okay? So it's like if you have very elaborate names, it's going to confuse you in the long run. I think this is just an extra tip. So if you want to name multiple variables on like a single line, you can do that. So here we have X, Y, and Z. Those are the names of our variables. They're 1-letter names. And we have orange, banana, and cherry. Those are strings, right? And we're essentially just naming them on one line. It's just for like to make it more concise. And if you print it out, X will become orange, Y will give you banana, and Z will give you cherry. So this isn't as important, but it's just like if you want to name them all on one line, you can do that if you want to. Okay, so this is actually like where we talk about Booleans. So again, before we were talking about how like Booleans only give you a true or false. This is also the case when you talk about evaluating a value as well. So there's actually a bool function that gives you true or false. And essentially the bool function, it will literally give you true in basically anything you give it, but there are some exceptions, of course. If you give it, so the exceptions here are if you give it an empty string simply is you have a string, you have two quotation marks, but you have nothing inside it. That's an empty string. It will return to you, then the bool function will return to you false. If you have the number 0 and you put it in the bool function, it will give you false. So essentially, if you give it any number, any string, you put it in the bool function, it'll give you true, because there's actually a certain value within it. There's actually a value within the variable. But if you give it an empty one, there's no value, it will return to you false or 0. So this is like bool function, I don't think it's as useful, but of course, like Booleans are also used more prevalently in loops. So do you have any questions so far before we move on? So the next part is we're talking about operators. So we're moving away from data types. Okay, so I guess we can move on.
All right, we'll move on. Okay, yeah, so essential operators. Yeah, so there's many operators, and operators are used to perform operations on variables and values. So Python divides the operators into the following groups: arithmetic operators, so like addition, subtraction, division. And we have assignment operators, comparison operators, logical operators, identity operators, membership operators. And there's a last one called bitwise operators, but we won't be worrying about that. So I know it sounds pretty like complicated, but they're just like, they're pretty simple once you get to understand how it works. All right, so arithmetic operators. I would say this is one of the most important operators that you will learn in Python. All right, so the addition symbol obviously is just addition. An example is we can add x to y. So obviously we know if x and y are strings or if x or y are integers, the results will obviously be different as shown in the example. We have a subtraction symbol. So yeah, same thing, but you cannot subtract strings. That won't allow. You have to use something called slicing to deal with strings, but we'll worry about that later on. We have this like multiplication sign. So x times y, if those are numbers, 10 times 10 gives us 100. We have division, modulus. So modulus is a bit special. It's basically remainder, right? So if we want to find the remainder of 10 when divided by 2, we can replace x with 10 and y with 2. And then if the result is equal to 0, then we know that there's no remainder. So this modulus symbol is really, really important if we want to check if a number is even or odd. All right, so exponentiation, so just 2 asterisks, Floor division, so basically removes decimals, not rounding. That just removes the decimals. And if we want to round, we have to use a math function. And yeah, so I think before we move on, I want to note that it's really important to understand that certain operators can be used with certain data types. Like for example, like obviously you cannot subtract a string from another string, as that idea firstly is very abstract, but you just firstly cannot do it. If you try to do it, the compiler will run an error. But all these examples, or all these operators can be used with integers, but you have to be careful when you're using these operators with other data types, for example, such as strings, booleans, and lists. All right, so assignment operators. So assignment operators are used to assign values to variables. I won't go through all of them as they're pretty similar, as you can see in the examples, but let's say I'll just go with like the first 3. So the equal sign, very simple. You're just setting a number equal to a certain value. But then if we have plus equal, that's actually an abbreviation for x is equal to x plus 3. So if you want to add 3 to the variable x, you can write the abbreviated. You can write x plus equal to 3, but you can also write x is equal to x plus 3. So usually programmers use the simpler version because Obviously, we want to do things very quickly, and it's just a shortcut that we would use. And that same thing applies for all the other operators.
Okay, let's
there
talk
any-
about. Okay, yeah, sure. Before we move on,
Questions?
anything that Austin talked about in the last 5 minutes?
Oh, I got a question. I thought modulus was supposed to be called oh yeah, it's just a different name. So modulus percentage sign, it's all the same thing. And I think you want a clarification on what floor division does. Yeah, no problems. We can go back. Yeah, so floor division, double slash sign, just removes like the decimals if there is decimals after you divide something.
Okay, so it basically rounds it to like the nearest whole number. That's what it does.
Yeah.
Or like no, not it doesn't round. Okay,
Yeah.
that's the okay. Sorry, that was the wrong thing. So it just if you do division and it has a bunch of decimals after it, it just cuts it off and just gives you the whole number. Okay, let's talk about comparison operators. So this actually has to do with Booleans as well, because what it'll return to you is either true or false, because you're comparing two values and seeing if they're equal, if they're not equal, if they're greater than or less than, and it'll tell you if it's true or false. So I think you guys, if you know math, like it's very self-explanatory. So the first one, two equal sign, you're checking if two variables are equal. This is different from one equal sign, which is assigning a variable. If you saw before, when we were assigning variables, we used one equal sign, right? In this case, we're using two equal signs side by side to check if two variables have the same value. And we also have not equal, which is an exclamation mark and an equal sign. We have larger than, less than, so like or greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. So I think they're very self-explanatory when you're comparing two values. Okay, so now we can talk about logical operators. I think it's better if I use an example. So let's say we have an if statement. We're gonna go back to if statements. So the standard way of using an if statement is if we say if something is true, if this is true, then like it will execute a certain line of code. If it's not true, it'll do something else. But when we have a condition, we can add multiple conditions. So we can say if this is true and something else is true, then we execute this line of code. So that's when we use these logical operators. We combine conditions. We say if this is true or this is true, or we can say if this is true and this is true, then we do something, right? So we can combine conditions together when we're using and or like or. And of course, not will give you the reverse of whatever condition that you currently have. So
I
this
have a question.
yeah.
What happened to the screen? There you go.
Is the screen good?
Wait, can you guys see the screen? Can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah.
I can see.
Yeah.
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 Okay, so if you have
I
problems
can
with the
see the
screen,
screen now.
oh, you can see it now. Okay, cool.
Yeah, yeah, good. So if you have any problems with the screen, just let us know. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. I think you should disable.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're good now. Thank you for the arrow pointing to the screen.
Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so membership operators. I think this is a little more of the confusing side, but this is one of the last slides we're going to have. So when we talk about membership operators, it tests if a certain, it says it tests if a certain element is a member of a collection. So an example would be, I can test if a few letters exist in a string. So I can say if the letter A is in the string Andrew, it'll check if the letter A is in the string Andrew, and it'll return to me true or false, right? Or you can check if the letter if the letter R is in Andrew, is not in Andrew, of course it will return to me false because the letter R is in my name, right? So these operators in or not in, it will check if a certain element exists in a collection in another variable or not. And then we have identity operators. So this essentially says, this is, I guess, a little confusing. So it says essentially it's also to compare two values, but it's not that if they're equal, but if they're the same, like for example, data type. So if I have a float, or if I have and I have a string, the float is 5.00 and not a string. This float is 5.00 and an integer is 5. They're both the number 5, but they're different values, right? They're different data. They're actually different data types. So if I have identity operators and if I compare two different variables with different data types, it's going to say that they're different, even though they might have the same value. They're both the number 5. Like if I compare them, it'll still return to me false. So this identity operators isn't to compare if that value is equal. It's to compare like if they're essentially this, like if they're the same data type. Okay, so I think we're basically done with all of that. So the next thing, I think we just have Austin's gonna explain a few like other random info. But we're done with the bulk of all the the information.
Yeah. So before I get into the important functions, I really want to stress that it's really important that you guys go home and review this, because obviously you're not going to be able to like remember most of the stuff we've talked about today. So it's really important that you review like the things we've talked about, because once you start programming and once we get into if statements next class, if you don't know how to use like membership operators or arithmetic operators, you're going to be in for a lot of trouble, because it's going to really slow down your programming when you have to search things up online in order to refresh your memory. So I highly recommend you guys to review the slides after this class. All right, so let's get into other important functions. So as you've seen in my demonstrations, I've used the input function. So if you want to input strings, just write x is equal to input to parentheses, and then if you want to input if you want to input integers, put int in front of that. Write a parentheses, type input, and then write another parentheses, and then the other side of the parentheses will be done automatically by Python. And yeah, output, just type print and then quotation marks, and then you can print hello world, for example, but ensure to have that in quotation marks, or you'll have problems, because it's going to assume that hello world is an integer without those quotation marks, and that's going to cause an error. Okay, examples of program that takes in a user inputted name and outputs a sentence. All right, yeah, for sure, we can do that. I can change my screen. Okay, so let's do that. So let's say firstly we have to input our name. Name is equal to input. So the input's taken care of now. So now we can input the name. So what else do we have to do? So we have to print the name. So print quotation marks. Oh, whoops. Let's delete that. My name is, we can put a colon there, leave a blank. So my name is, and the name we input isn't like just conjoined together. We can do an add symbol, and we can put our variable name in there. So I guess I can input this now. Does anyone want to propose a name that we should input? Do we have
King Kong?
King Kong? All right, that works as well. So King Kong. Yeah, so and then our program will run. My name is King Kong. And yeah, so if you want to be a bit more advanced, we can put in first name and then last name. They're both strings, so we both input them as strings. So now, obviously, since the variable does not match, we have a red line to indicate that error. So we can write my name is first name, and then we can add last name. We can run that, King, and then we can add Kong, and that works as well. So just something to think about.
I think for now, just you should like look at the syntax involved. Look at how we use an equal sign, right? To essentially, we're whatever the first two lines, we're essentially just assigning values to those variables. One variable is called first name. Second variable is called last name. Those are the names of the variables that Austin gave, right? And then when we use the input function, it lets the user input something. And whatever they input, it will automatically assign to that variable. And then what he did was he took those two variables and he put it together in a sentence, and he just like gave it back to us with the print function. The print function, look at how he uses the print function. You just write print and you have two round brackets. And whatever you have inside the print function, it will spit it back out to you.
What if you wanted to put a space between King and Kong?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So if I want to put a space between King and Kong, I think you guys could guess what I need to do. So basically put a quotation mark there, add another.
I hate to interrupt, but it is 5:50 right about now.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah, good call. So yeah, we'll try to speed this up. If you have to leave now, that's totally fine. Feel free to leave, but we'll try to finish up this lesson as there's very important things that we have to talk about later on. Yes, thank you for the time reminder. Okay, so yeah, we'll quickly finish this up. So example of programs, and yeah, so basically we're done now. So homework, have PyCharm downloaded, do the problems. We've linked some problems there. We'll post the slide and the recording onto the Google Classroom. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Be prepared for next class, as we'll be tackling more advanced problems. So I kind of before we all leave, I want to talk about the practice problems. So yeah, we have some practice problems here. They're really simple. Most of them should be pretty easy. The last few are a bit hard. But yeah, so just give these a try. I don't think it should be too hard. Most of these are pretty simple, especially 1 to 3. So it should be pretty manageable. And yeah, so we'll go over all these next class. If there's any questions, feel free to stay behind. Thank you guys for all coming out.